Hello, everybody, and welcome to Wednesday Writing Workshop. This workshop in particular is called Engaging with Scholarly Sources, How to Read Research. Thank you to all of you who are here this evening, and thank you so much for joining us at this exact 7 o'clock hour. We will begin promptly, and it's, again, so great to see all of you here. Just a quick note that if you do have your speaker, if you could just mute it, so there's no background noise, and please note that this recording will be, or this meeting will be recorded. All right, so let's begin. My name is Dr. Ashley Ott. I completed my PhD at St. Louis University. Today, I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about engaging with scholarly sources. What does it mean to read research? And I think most of you are probably very familiar with reading research, and I'm excited to just present with you with some strategies that will help you retain some of this information that you're learning in your classes for perhaps longer, and to take that information with you into more sort of advanced projects. Thinking about something in particular, moving up, what I'm going to show you in a moment is Bloom's taxonomy. So if I may, I'm going to share my screen with you and present. Let's see. All right. Again, I'm Dr. Ashley Ott, and I am presenting for the Academic Support Center at AU, where I, along with Augie Murato, who's here as the co-host, will be very happy to meet with you one-on-one at any point in the semester. And towards the end of this meeting, I will show you how to make an appointment, either for information and feedback on anything that you're writing, or just feedback in terms of reading processes. We can have what's called a academic coaching appointment that we can help you manage time, manage maybe the hard, heavy reading load that you have for some of those advanced classes or sort of beginning classes. When you read, on which level are you operating? And so this is a sort of imagination of how our skills are kind of hierarchical. It gives us this idea of thinking about classifying educational learning objectives into levels of complexity and specificity. So, for example, when you read a book, you maybe remember some of the details of that book. You can comprehend facts, and you're sort of understanding what's going on in that book. Perhaps, or maybe you get stuck and have to reread things a few times to understand that material. But do you apply that material, pulling concepts of that particular book or that particular scholarly article? Can you draw those concepts and actually apply them beyond the article? Further up this hierarchy, we have analysis, this skill that is a little bit even more difficult than applying, understanding, and remembering. It's to break the content into smaller parts. And throughout this presentation, I'll be using the words close reading, deep reading, and analysis to describe the practices of reading that sort of move us up this hierarchy. Evaluation of a source is when you start to critique the source and start questioning. For example, if you're looking at a scholarly article, thinking about the methods section of a particular social work article, thinking about the discussion section and the results sections, and how you pick those apart and kind of understand or judge the information that you're receiving. And then finally, creating. For most of you, this is something that you're all asked to do at the college level, to think about, how you can take these existing pieces in which you're reading and apply those then to the creation of your own work, your own pieces of writing, your own projects that you're working on. And so I wanted to do a quick poll. What level do you think you're operating on when you're reading scholarly sources? Not necessarily for pleasure reading, but thinking about those scholarly articles, journal chapters, peer-reviewed articles, thinking about anthology readings. So if you wouldn't mind, there's a quick poll. Which level do you think you're working on this hierarchy? I have one response that says evaluation, which is great. You're able to do all of those things from remember, understand, apply, analyze, up to evaluate. So click on the one that's sort of the highest level that you can achieve consistently across your readings for your classes. Thank you to all of you participating. I see it, the poll is working.
If we're only reading, wouldn't the highest be evaluate?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Do you want me to type it? I said, if we're only reading, wouldn't the highest level we could be is evaluate?
Um, no, I think what for the creating part, what I'm hoping to see is that you feel comfortable enough with the reading that you will take that material and be able to create something with it, hypothetically. All right, good. So it looks like from our poll that here we are moving from evaluating, which is a really high level of thinking. Analysis is strong, applying concepts is strong, and understanding. So a lot of you, the bulk of you, for like 35% of you, are kind of towards this lower, beginning to understand and remember the text, which is great. That's a great start, and applying some of that too. And a few of you have kind of moved up to feeling confident with analysis, evaluation, and sort of the ability to create text from those readings. And so that's just something to keep in mind when you're reading. I'd like to do this at the beginning of our meeting because I wanted to show you that sort of in high school, the goals are to have students remember and to understand. And at the college level, it's really to achieve application, analysis, evaluation, and creation. And so how do we get to those levels? What are some strategies that I can offer you? And so for those of you who are sort of apply, understand, remember, I hope that there are some things that in this presentation you can take with you to apply and to sort of test or balance with the readings that you're encountering in your classes. So before we begin on some of these strategies, I'm going to X out of here. I'd like you to, if you check the chat box, all of you please open your chat box. And Augie, if you wouldn't mind pasting the link to the chat for the Google form, I'd like you to each take a quick look at some of the practices that you use already when you're close reading, especially for thinking about reading research, scholarly sources. So this link, if you click on the chat box, should open up a form for you to complete. It'll look like this: a first reflection on your reading process. So I want to give you just a couple minutes to think about this form to complete the answers. It's really just a checkbox. You can check multiple for each one. And when you get to the end, please submit your answers. And as you're going, think about some of these strategies in terms of a process, that there's pre-reading strategies. There's actually active reading strategies when you're reading your text. And then there's also post-reading strategies. So things that you can do after you're finished reading your text to help you reinforce and sort of internalize the information. So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to complete this form, and then I'll pull up the results just to kind of see where we're at in terms of the kinds of strategies you use already, and perhaps identify some of the things that you could potentially engage in if you haven't. Hello to some of you familiar faces out there. Thank you so much. I see there's 10 responses so far. I'll give you about 1 more minute just to kind of finish up any final checks that you have in your screen. And again, this particular form is meant not only to sort of evaluate what you do, but to show you like perhaps some ideas in some areas that you might consider using in your own practice for reading scholarly research. So this is really fantastic. Thank you. And you can keep adding to it if you're still working on it. That's fine. I think, can everyone see, Augie, is this visible? The in which format do you prefer to read is the sort of first box here on the screen. Great. So again, I guess the question is, which do you prefer to read? And so it's, of course, print and then screen followed by audio, which I would have guessed anyway. But I should have maybe asked you, in which format do you often read? And it's probably maybe different. I find that there's a tendency now, especially, to be reading more on the screen. And so I wonder if that's most of your experiences. And so I have a little bit to say about the difference in reading print versus screen. And then audio, of course, is really interesting too. I think there's a lot of features that we can use to our advantage on computers that have the sort of speak function so that you can actually listen to the text as you're going through it as well. So that's something to look into. Pre-reading strategies. So I've broken up our presentation into thinking about reading as a process, just as writing as a process. And the pre-reading strategies can help you prepare mentally for like what you're going to encounter. So activating prior knowledge. It looks like a lot of you, the majority of you, estimate how much time you will need to read, which is really great. I often have appointments where I work with students, and I'm happy to do this. But to plan out, you know, for especially graduate students who have hundreds of pages to read a week, what to do, how to attend to those, how do I read all of those and kind of absorb all this information, it can become a little overwhelming. And so estimating how much time you need to read, sitting in about 30 to 1 hour chunks, no more than that, will help you kind of gear up and sort of pace yourself. Also, predicting content by identifying specific genres is really helpful too. Identifying to the text genre using titles, pictures, and words. So thank you for that. Those are 2 really great strategies. Some other things you might consider then: activating prior knowledge, seeking guiding questions or themes before starting. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And familiarity with how this material applies to course projects. So those 2 are really important. Not only what are you reading, but why is it important that you're reading those things? Great. Active reading strategies, things that you do while you're actually reading. And of course, this is going to vary depending upon whether you're reading from a screen or a print text. Always important to annotate or write or reflect upon what you're thinking about. Summarizing, looking up unfamiliar vocabulary, excellent. I'm glad so many of you are already doing that. And limiting distractions while reading. And I'll talk and again, a few moments about how you can do that as well, especially if you're reading on a screen. One thing to notice about highlighting, however, is that researchers have found that highlighting information doesn't necessarily help you retain information or understand it any better, unless you're really careful with how you highlight. If you tend to highlight because you're tracking the reading as you go, or you're just sort of using it as a tool to help you kind of move through the paragraph, then it actually doesn't do much for you. So be careful with highlighting and sort of placing too much an emphasis on thinking like, if I'm highlighting well, I'm really understanding it. There is a little bit of research that kind of goes against that particular process. But of course, if it helps you and you sort of have a strategy for strategy and that works for you, of course, you know, keep with it. And then post-reading strategies, which do you use? Again, is there a process for reading after you're finished with the text? And yes, there is. I can return to the text to support points during discussion and for assignments. I use specific textual details to support my responses. I'm able to recount the text orally or in writing. Again, thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, actually getting to the analysis and the application phase rather than just sort of understanding the text. I can connect ideas and issues across texts and record class notes about the text efficiently. And so these are the real goals. This is not only are you sort of reading for the class and for cramming for the test, but that you can retain the information beyond this class and apply it not only to that particular class, but to your career here at AU. So continue to think about how your text serves a purpose beyond that particular lesson, chapter, class, semester. And then prioritizing and reviewing. This is really helpful too. And maybe you do it, maybe you don't, but this is another thing to think about, that you can actually review the material, which will help you significantly in retaining your information. And so it looks like a lot of you read when you're most alert. And when I was in school, I would always put it off or spend a lot of time in the evening doing it when I was tired, and that is not as effective, especially because you have to reread and then recall that information, which makes it harder. And you complete your readings every week. Fantastic. Wow, you guys are great. Minimizing distractions. And finally, I estimate how much time I will need. So that's great. Again, prioritizing and reviewing. Studies show that if you do read when you're more alert, that obviously will help you retain the information better. Based on your self-assessment, what are your goals for developing your reading skills? I'm just going to kind of breeze through these. Be able to get less distracted. Okay. Yeah, long assignments because of lack of interest or just too much at one time, absolutely. Making an effort to go over and review what I've written and keeping a better schedule for reading. Applied research, feel like I am competent enough, that's great. And I hope you can offer us some feedback too in terms of what makes you a good reader and how that can benefit the rest of us. Learn how to manage reading time in more effective ways to study the text. Developing reading skills or to ask more questions about texts. Another goal is to improve vocabulary. How not to get distracted, to truly understand what I'm reading and retain it, absolutely. Thinking how to take notes and read, also to read more efficiently. Yeah, not comprehending when you're reading. Minimizing distractions, become a better reader and read faster and analyze texts better than before. Good, so kind of increasing your speed. Better my active reading strategies, be able to read faster and comprehending concepts, take a deeper look into reading and take more notes while helping me after, not procrastinate. Again, that's a sort of pre-reading strategy to kind of manage time. Good. Know how to learn reading research, trying to connect the material from the reading, looking up words. Again, that's a repeated one we've seen, and trying to memorize what just read sometime when my mind wanders. Absolutely. And I wish to work on comprehending the text, not just skimming the book for important details. Good. Yeah, so this sort of skim reading, great. All fantastic. So thank you for these goals, things to keep in mind for this particular session.
Actually, we do have a quick question in the chat.
Yeah.
So Mike wants to know if we're going to cover navigating the reducibility crisis.
I'm not sure. Is that what is the reducibility crisis? I'm not sure I'm familiar with that.
Just the idea that most scientific studies, particularly those in the social sciences, tend to be hard to replicate or reproduce exactly.
Oh, okay. So thinking about how a particular article, and you're talking about for your own publication methods or for reading?
I didn't specify. It was just, yeah, are we going to cover the navigating the reducibility crisis?
Probably not in this particular session, but that's something that we could talk about during probably a specific appointment, if that would be something of interest. I'd love to. Thank you. Thanks for your questions. Keep them coming. Thanks, Augie. All right, so this is your brain on Jane Austen, and Stanford researchers are taking notes. Augie, if you wouldn't mind sending the link to the student, to our group here, just so that they can find this article if they need to. I wanted to just mention something that came up in the poll as sort of, I want to work on creating purposeful questions or seeing how the text that I'm reading applies to class. And so I just wanted to show you that basically, cognitive dynamics of different kind of focuses that we bring to reading impact the way we retain information. So Natalie Phillips, who received her PhD at Stanford in 2010, did this study a while back. She now has an article published on this, a scholarly journal. This is just sort of the Stanford News article version. But she takes a neuroscientific approach to literary analysis, and she's found through this experiment by putting PhD candidates into an MRI machine and examining the different ways that our brains work, that basically purposeful reading and pleasure reading activate different parts of the brain. Not necessarily that one is better than the other, but that there's a marked strategy with purposeful reading, thinking about reading in terms of finding an answer or to examine a text with a particular perspective or need to gain information, preps your brain in a different way than if you're sitting sort of on the beach or in your room at night reading for pleasure. It's a completely different function. And so one of the things I want to point out in our time together is that it's really important to think about in what ways what you're reading applies to what you're writing on or what kinds of projects you're creating in class. So not to think of them as sort of distinct elements, assignment here I have to read, then I have to complete this assignment, but to actually think about them as sort of unified goals. And so I hope that, for most of you, this is probably pretty obvious, but students should be thinking about how much time they can devote to readings, but specifically when you are reading actively with purpose, in order to learn, the writing process is also easier. And so how can you read with purpose? I've been offering some feedback to students. One of them is to think about specifically chapter or textbook readings, to turn those section headings into kind of questions for yourself so that you're sitting there as an active reader than sort of a passive observer. The other thing is that you might use like the questions at the end for critical analysis. Think about exams that you're taking and the kinds of questions you're being asked, and also to connect what you're reading to class lecture. And so to have an idea of what perhaps you're focusing on with your particular instructor. Of course, remembering that these textbooks for most of you are made for just the generic social work class, for example, but that in your particular class, your professor is going to have his or her own knowledge to draw from and wants to sort of point out to you. And so what can you focus on? What kind of purpose do you have for reading chapter 1 on attachment theory? Something like that. So reading with purpose is really important. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, what does it mean to be reading carefully or reading scholarly research? What does that look like in terms of active reading? And you've thought through a few of those things in the Google form, which we're telling you a few different strategies for engaging with the text. Most of them, by the way, were for print text, right? So touching, handling, writing on, marking up your pages, adding sticky notes, those kinds of things are for that physical text. But for those of you who are watching, what is a critical reader? Out of these three, which one would you guess is sort of the most critical, the most careful and engaged scholarly reader in this set of three?
I would guess number 1.
Why would you guess number 1? That's great. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think because he says he's more interacting with the text, and I think his own thoughts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that because he's this reader, we'll just say he or she is reading this text for 2 hours and still has 30 pages to go. I guess I'll be here all night. The one problem with this particular reader is that the reader's confused and takes a little bit too long to read, despite not actually comprehending the text. And so I see this a lot too, where students are spending a lot of time reading, actually setting aside lots of time to dedicate to the text, but they're not comprehending or understanding. So they're good, they're dedicated students here, but what's happening is they're not sort of understanding fully what they're reading. And so this is a good practice, but not the best out of the three. Andrew, which one would you think was the runner-up for you?
I would say number 2.
Good. Okay, number 2. So basically, if we didn't choose number 1, number 2 is the more critical reader, because the reader is asking questions, making connections with prior knowledge, and changing strategies when something isn't working. I'm a little confused by this language. Maybe I should look up who this theorist is and go to a quieter place to study. So kind of identifying what exactly that student doesn't understand and how to learn more about that is important. And some of you marked, thinking about vocabulary in your writing. I'm looking up words. It's as simple as that, and trying to understand the fuller context of that particular paragraph you're looking at, using context clues in the reading to understand what these words or theories or concepts refer to. And number 3, again, nothing wrong with number 3 either, but enjoying the book, but it's just a bit too casual, right? So having sort of questions and having a little bit of a struggle, I think, is necessary for trying to engage with more complex scholarly reading. So thanks for looking at those 3. Thank you, Andrew, for your feedback. And so again, this is just a I'm sure most of you are very familiar with this "reading research takes time" quote, but I read this excellent book called Read or Come Home by Marianne Wolf. She's a neurocognitive scientist, and she examines how we read from a linguistic perspective and a neurology perspective. And she says that the quality of how we read any sentence or text depends on the choices we make with the time we allocate to the processes of deep reading. And again, deep reading is that tough engagement with text, that sort of rumination where you think about a particular passage for a little while, or you sit with the text and kind of think about what a concept, what the concept means and what kinds of an impact that particular theory has on your field. Regardless of medium, it takes years for deep reading processes to be formed. And as a society, she advocates that we need to be sure, that we're specifically young children, that we're kind of teaching them how to read and to think carefully about text as well. That's sort of another angle on her research. She says it takes daily vigilance by us, the expert readers, to choose to expend the extra milliseconds needed to maintain deep reading over time. And I'm sure you've all come across the articles, is Google making us stupid? Is the internet changing our ability to think well? And basically, this is sort of her response to some of those maybe oversimplified questions, which is we still need to keep practicing deep reading despite being maybe filled with words. A lot of scholars have argued that people are reading less, and actually Marianne Wolf says that the average person consumes about 34 gigabytes across varied devices each day, which is the equivalent of about 100,000 words. So for no apparent reason, we are reading a ton of language, but that what we do with that language is sort of different than what we've done perhaps pre sort of screen reading, for example. She says, first, we simplify. Second, we process the information as rapidly as possible. More precisely, we read more in briefer bursts. Okay. Third, we triage. We stealthily begin the insidious trade-off between our need to know with our need to save and gain time. And so I feel this pull when I'm reading, that I want to read it quickly and I want to sort of engage that text and kind of strip the knowledge that I need from it as quickly as possible. And we have to really learn to sort of resist that urge to kind of find what we need immediately and to be comfortable with that kind of slower process of information comprehension. So that's just my shtick there in terms of thinking about reading carefully and slowly. But yeah, so engaging with scholarly digital text is a whole different game now, right? So how do we engage with, for most of us, all of these texts that we're reading, perhaps online? I think a lot of you have ebooks now. That's sort of the easiest thing to get through AU Library at this particular moment. Reading all of our materials on Moodle, for example, everything is sort of screen. So how do we, first of all, engage with this sort of idea of cognitive patience, which is Marianne Wolf's term for the quality of reading and the quality of thought, that they're balanced heavily, and it's heavily changed by our attention, right? So we need to bring to reading this idea of cognitive patience. How will you minimize distractions? How do you minimize distractions? I'm just kind of curious. Can I throw that question out to you? Do any of you make a concerted effort not to be distracted? Or is it kind of one of those things where it's like, well, if I get a text, or if I'm checking Facebook, or if I'm kind of doodling over here, or I'm eating dinner over here, is that sort of part of your reading process or not? Do you have like specific methods that are really regimented and sort of deny any of those kind of urges?
I don't allow myself to have my phone by me, and I'm, make it silent for at least an hour.
Wow, that's great.
Because it's really distracting.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have that? You have amazing discipline. Better than I. Does anyone else have anything that they do in terms of reading on the screen in particular that helps sort of you focus a little bit better? Marianne Wolf says that screen reading lends itself to a 90% higher level of distraction than if you're reading a print text, just by virtue of it being online.
I isolate. I isolate, but I roll with it. Like I'll do it bursts. I'll be focused on stuff, and then I'll maybe like get lost or confused with something, and I find it's actually healthy for me, which probably isn't for most people, or maybe I'm lying to myself. But you know, I will take a detour, and that will lead me somewhere, and I'll usually come back, and like it's some weird, like, but I always come back, like, and that little break kind of helps me, like, I don't know, refocus. But like you're saying, smaller bursts
Yeah.
instead of long, prolonged tracks of focus, like, is like kind of been my pattern as of late.
Great, absolutely. Thank you so much for
And
sharing, Mike. I think that's fantastic. There's a term for that particular way of studying in the writing field. And it's not going to come to me at this particular moment, but there's a study that shows that actually people are really productive. Writers do very different things in terms of their writing processes. Some people compose in bursts, like you're talking about, and then are more productive by stopping, changing the laundry out, and coming back to writing after they folded something than it is to just sort of sit there. And so I kind of see what you're saying in terms of reading, how that would be a similar activity where it's, I'm going to focus for this short burst, and then I'll come back to it later. And that doesn't necessarily mean you stop thinking about the question, but perhaps, you know, need some sort of distraction to help you continue to think about that rather than sort of sitting there.
Kind of like a deeper processing, like, you know, yeah, I'm staring at a YouTube video or my friend or whatever, but at the same time, on some level, I think maybe I'm like hashing out something I read or piecing it into a context before going forward.
Great.
Which, like, I don't know if that's completely like a lack of discipline and a haphazard way of, like, you know, but yeah, that's just kind of how it goes.
No, I think that's fantastic. And by no means is this presentation meant to sort of shun anyone or make anyone feel like their practices are not good. It's meant to really just show you that they're sort of the options that you have and to choose what works best for you, really. But yeah, so there's these ideas, especially with screen reading, that there's this theory of a technique called hyperattention. Catherine Hales talks about it as a phenomenon caused by task switching, high levels of stimulation, and the low level threshold of boredom. I am sort of feeling that way when I work online. And this idea of continuous partial attention by Linda Stone, who talks about virtual, at Microsoft she works, and it's a term that captures the way children attend to their digital devices and then to their environments. And so it's just, we have to just be careful. It's just a word of caution if you're reading online, that we have to, instead of transferring that kind of quick pacing that we use for example, Facebook or whatever else that we're doing online, skimming the news, that we don't take that practice and then take it and read our text in that similar way. Or just not to be surprised that if you're reading something, it will be impacted by the way you use the internet in other ways beyond that text. So if you're feeling like the pull of, you know, focus is hard, if you're feeling like you can't understand, you have to keep reading the passage, it could be helpful that you just simply print out the text, or just to kind of give yourself that space and say, I have to sort of dedicate more time to simply focusing on this task. The other thing you have to think about when reading online is, how are you going to retrieve or return to this material later? It's much more easy to have a textbook and have things kind of highlighted, but how are you going to, if you're reading this text online, how are you going to come back and search, you know, have searchable features for it? How are you going to, you know, find where you left off and engage with that material for research projects, for example? And so those are the things to keep in mind. Augie, if you wouldn't mind sending the participants, I have a Google Doc that you're free to use and to copy for your own use. It's basically a nice, I've seen a couple professors have various iterations of this document, but it's meant to show you, let's see if I can pull it up here. It's meant to just give you, again, thinking about reading with purpose, an idea of how to go about reading, what kinds of things to think about, what kinds of things to consider as you're reading. It also provides you kind of a record if you're reading a ton of material that you can, I just allowed you a space to create your own citation for the article, but to think about, you know, what is the background, methods, and nature of the study, just as sort of a brief synthesis of what you're reading. Results, it gives you some ideas of what to think about as you're reading. So if you'd like to keep this or use it for your own work, if you wouldn't mind just making a copy of it and using that one rather than this sort of one that's shared right now, but just to give you a sense of, you know, one organizational method out of a whole bunch to think about as you're reading and trying to retain the information. All right. Okay, thank you guys. making our way. So again, coming back to this idea of distraction and how much are we reading, how little are we reading, it's not really the issue about how much we consume. It's about the significant effects of how much we read upon how we read, and the effects of both upon what we read and remember. And so again, coming back to that idea of retaining information is sort of our essential and overall goal. So I'm going to ask you, just open this up to the audience, why are journal articles especially challenging to engage with? I think most of you are probably reading secondary source material. Maybe you're not, but for those of you who aren't, this is sort of a heads up when you get there. But what are some of the things that are challenging to engage with in terms of the genre of journal, scholarly research journal articles?
Statistics.
Absolutely, statistics. Perhaps in the method section or the results sections of these articles. What else? What makes them more difficult than reading a sort of popular source?
I don't know if this makes sense, but it doesn't feel very engaging. Is that?
Yeah, who is the audience? The audience isn't everyone, right? It's someone very specific, very specialized, absolutely. It's not meant for your entertainment at this point. It's meant for someone to sort of build off of a particular experiment and maybe duplicate or challenge or learn from. Exactly. The audience is completely different for journal articles. Thank you. Anyone else have ideas about, your reading articles? Why are they different than, reading a book, maybe you are reading book, scholarly book too, but more popular sources in general?
The one thing that's hard for when I read a source like that is what I call the spiderweb effect. It's kind of they have to discuss every aspect of every situation because obviously it's scholarly, so you want to make sure that you're explaining everything.
Yeah.
Lost in the mundane and tedious information.
Absolutely. So you're thinking about on the writing side even, what kinds of things you have to assume the reader knows and to cover your bases for the things that you can't overgeneralize about. Absolutely. Sort of the background knowledge, right? You have to, who's the intended audience and are they likely to be experts on the subject? Yes. Sometimes they assume you're already familiar with certain terms and specific kind of background knowledge, and sometimes they don't. But yeah, thank you. That's great. Other ideas about why it's just challenging, why it takes longer to read a journal article, why it might be harder to grapple with?
Well, because we're not specialized in the field. I think that's part of it. And I noticed, this is just me, one that I had was 15 pages long, and I tried to read it on the screen, and no matter what I did, I just couldn't retain it from the screen. So I had to print it out. It wasn't possible for me. I don't know if anyone else struggles with that.
Can anyone else speak to that? That's a really great question and something I'm still thinking about.
Yeah, I can relate. I feel like it's a lot easier for me to read when it's printed out on paper. I feel like I can comprehend a lot better than when reading it off a screen.
Is it bad to say that I like the whole spiderweb effect thing, defining the definitions in the very specific terms of this, that, at some point I'm just okay, dude, yeah, I see what you're doing here, but I get it, and I just kind of will just skip over it. Then I'll see the crazy statistics, and I'll be like, yeah, math, okay, whatever, let's keep going. And I kind of get to the information that I'm looking to consume to see if any of it's even viable, instead of wasting 40 minutes of my time reading some insane amount of research trying to understand a bunch of stuff I probably don't even need to be understanding to begin with before I even decide if I can make use of the journal for what I'm using. And then I cite it, and then I kind of feel like a fraud because it's well, do I really you know what I mean? And then I start to go around. And then there's that, like I said earlier, that reproducibility thing. Is this even valid research when you have 30% of most scientific things being published not really holding a lot of validity in certain fields? So then I'm so am I writing a bunch of stuff and trying to apply a bunch of research, and is this even worth anything? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is my constant struggle. It's then what the hell am I even doing? That's how I feel. I feel like a fraud,
No, I totally understand that, where you're coming from. It can be overwhelming, and especially, I think this is where like thinking about reading with purpose comes in. So information gathering, different than sort of information processing. So you might have 15 articles, you skim through them, finding the best ones to use. But that's something that these researchers, these neuroscientists are thinking about in terms of both screen reading, but also what screen reading does to how we sort of understand text or think about text. And they say that we use like the zigzag pattern when we read screens rather than sort of in a print where we kind of go from line to line more carefully. But just kind of, they found in a study that freshmen in universities, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's like, 30% of the students quoted from the first page and the last page of the article. And so you can kind of see that it's just like, it's kind of like broad skimming, right? So like, here's the introduction, that's what they say they're going to do, and here's the results. This is what, this is what we're quoting from, which perhaps reflects what they're actually reading to begin with, right? So quoting from the beginning or the end. And so I think some of the things that make, as you've all pointed out, reading these scholarly articles is that you have to have a certain amount of background knowledge. And so the only way to do that, of course, is to keep taking your classes and reading, right? There's specialized vocabulary. There's also a learning curve with that, having to kind of beef up your lexical set so that you're able to, get through a sentence, right? Just like in foreign language. Thinking about the purpose, the author may make a claim, develop an argument, or share an opinion. Look for this in the article's title and abstract. The title and the abstract are the introductory summary paragraphs, and so that'll give you a good sense too of what's going to be happening or what to look for. The focus for the research, or the focus for the journals, is usually research, so either the author's own or the work of other scholars on the subject. And the text is likely to include many references to other researchers. So sometimes it's just hard to sort through like all of the studies to catch yourself up on what's been going on in this field. The specificity, the level of specificity with these journal articles too, is narrow, highly specific topics or perspectives within a larger subject. So I always say if you're beginning, starting your initial research, is always great to just go to the text, the big books, the larger textbooks, to kind of find out where you want to find your way in the subject before homing in on, that study in Turkey that looked at students in a particular setting with iPad games. Formatting, the content may be presented in standardized sections. These include the abstract background, methods, usually results, discussion, conclusion, and then the references of what they've all consulted. And then there's also this lack of visuals, right? The appearance itself is just kind of daunting, right? There may be few or no subheadings. There may be just graphs, very sparse illustrations. If you find illustrations, that's great for you. But yes, it's very text heavy, and as you have been pointing out, really hard to read on a screen. And research has shown that, that sort of tangible nature of reading a book locates you differently in the book. You have a spatial sense that's much different. It's geometrical than if you're on a screen, which is just sort of more like a scroll, right? You're just kind of scanning down, and there's no sense of space. There's really no sense of orientation because it's always changing. And so that, for some of you, might be a problem. That might be something that you have to think about in terms of how you want to access these texts. But there are strategies I've been thinking about how you can better combat some of those hesitations or those complications as you're working online on a screen. We're going to get into, in the second part of this discussion, I'm going to provide you with a sample article. Thank you to Andrea Lumley, who sent me a scholarly article to think about that she's looking at in class right now. So we're going to talk about that article in a few minutes. Before we get there though, reading with purpose also requires that we think about what kind of genre that we're reading in. I think a lot of your classes ask you to discern the difference between quantitative articles and qualitative articles. So just a very brief kind of outline here, that quantitative articles are usually numerically represented research. They have empirical quantitative research, typically analyzes using statistics, data analyses, and modeling techniques that rely on the numerical properties of the measurement system. Whereas qualitative articles, and just an aside that they can be mixed, qualitative and quantitative, but that qualitative articles in particular have their own set of research norms, which is to generate knowledge about human experience, including social processes, and their kind of evidence includes natural language, observations, participants' expressions, things like that, that can't, be measured as sort of numerically as some other kinds of studies might. But for both of these kinds of articles, we see introductions, we see a method section, we see a results section, and a discussion. So you should just become familiar with that particular format: intro, method, results, and discussion, so that you can kind of orient yourself in the particular article more easily. Again, this is more typical of the sciences. If you're in the humanities, there still might be that kind of movement, but we don't typically break those sections down into such compartmentalized and defined areas. So again, coming back to pre-reading strategies, let's minimize distractions. I found 2 things that could potentially be helpful, and they're both free. There's lots of things that you can pay for that will probably do a nicer job, but I think that this is the most basic. There's something called self-control for Mac users, which will, you can say, like, I'm going to read this article online and I don't want to be bothered. I don't want to sort of dive into any other sites for about 30 minutes, and you set your time limit, and you're not able to access anything else on the computer unless you reboot it for 30 minutes. So it just kind of allows you just a little bit of control if some of you find that you have to be multitasking, which does in fact sort of, unless you're sort of doing what Andrew was doing, is pausing and then coming back to the text, can take away from your focus. If you're not a Mac user, there's also this thing called Stay Focused, and I looked into that. It's a Chrome application. And so you can select specific websites to, block for yourself for like 30 minutes. They also have this thing called a nuclear option, which allows for you to not look at any other website unless you like restart your computer. It will not allow you to exit the screen that you're looking at. So those are just some things, like if you find that you're always clicking, reading a paragraph, clicking back, that sort of hyper attention, that sort of continuous partial attention can distract from your efforts and actually essentially make the project much harder to accomplish. Again, asking guiding questions using, that handout that I gave you is just a very starting point. Thinking about the lecture and how this reading is going to fit into that. Thinking about your research project and what kinds of things you're going to need to know or to investigate later can also help you draw your attention to the article in particular ways. Previewing the abstract, here on the right here, this is the abstract. The abstract is always that, of course, that little chunk of text that gives you an idea of what the entire study is about, so that you don't waste your time reading an article, a self-selected article for research that is not relevant. And then gathering context. So again, thinking about what journal is this published in? Who are these authors? When was it published? And is it relevant to me? Is it relevant to our particular population that we're thinking about? So reading strategies while you're actually looking at your article. Again, I'm going to give you an activity to do in a minute. Reading strategically, thinking about how you want to do that, condensing and paraphrasing and annotating. How do we do that online? 1 or 2 different methods I've come across, and again, still in a very primitive phase, but I'm working on publishing an article on digital deep reading with Google Docs. And so I think that something that could be really helpful is that you read by taking your article, and in either, I think Adobe Acrobat allows this too, in both formats you can actually annotate the text, highlight the text, add comments to the text, again using your computer, which might not be sort of ideal, but is something nonetheless. And you can also collaborate, which I think is really excellent, something that you couldn't do if you printed your paper and you're working remotely, that you can actually collaborate with people in real time, leaving comments, leaving questions, sharing ideas about a particular text, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. After reading, revisiting, trying some active study strategies, explaining what you read, and answering questions or collaborating. And so the collaboration piece here, I'm going to have you test out because I haven't done Google Docs. Of course, you can share. And again, it requires that you translate what you're probably working with as a PDF into a Word document, which doesn't always work, and then sharing it with someone. But the Adobe Reader is actually really cool because it keeps the text in Adobe format, and you can share the link with any of your peers in class, and you can mark up the text how you will, and everyone will be able to see what you're doing. So I want you to simulate in groups best practices for engaging with scholarly sources. So thinking about pre-reading, what guiding questions might you use to direct your reading for this particular article, and I'll show you in a minute. What kind of article is this? Is it a qualitative article? Is it a quantitative study? And then close reading. Identify the key sections of this article: the abstract, methods, results, discussion sections. And what questions do you have as you read? Think back to your guiding question that you create. So again, thank you to Andrea for giving us this text. Augie, would you mind sharing in the chat box this Google Doc?
Already up there.
Thank you so much. So
Yeah,
this is
it's the most recent link as a heads up, yeah?
perfect. Yes. All right. So it should look like, everyone, is this what everyone sees? Are you able to see my image, Augie?
Yep.
The document? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So what you can see here is I've shared this with you. And what I'd like you to do, we're going to do just a breakout rooms for about 3 or 4 minutes. Just introduce yourselves to each other, and I want you to just very briefly skim the article and discuss maybe using that handout that I gave you, the Google Doc with all of the different ways of reading purposefully. You know, what about this article is going to be challenging, and what kind of a guiding question, if you could just imagine yourself as a social work student, what kind of a guiding question or what kind of a purpose might you use to read this particular article with? So think about the purpose for reading, and think about any potential, you know, roadblocks as you're skimming through this article as you go. So thinking about, you know, prepping before you actually, we're not going to have time, of course, to read this article, but things that you might run into as a problem as you engage with this article. But you can check, see, I left comments here. Feel free to leave your own comments. I think it requires that you sign in. I used my Google credentials, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I just wanted to show you that you can collaborate. All I did was download this article, open it in Adobe and sign in, and it sort of allows me to use these highlight tools, comment tools, text tools, and then to either download it if you want to access it again, or to share it. And you can copy the shared link, send it to other peers in your class, and work on these articles together. So I think something that could be really helpful in terms of close reading, especially scholarly articles, is that you don't have to do them alone. They can be things that you share or engage with, especially if they're part of a class, a sort of a class curriculum. So Augie, would you mind splitting everybody up into groups of 4 different groups, and we'll come back at about 7:55, just to kind of have them work and kind of look at the article together, come up with any questions or comments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome
back, everybody. I'm going to be mindful of your time. We have 3 minutes remaining, but I just wanted to hear any initial problems or questions. Hopefully, I don't know if you came up with like a purposeful question for this particular article, but perhaps you noticed it was meant for a specific audience. So any quick results, reactions, questions that you have about, you know, encountering a text like this, what you're looking at, vocabulary, anything like that, that could be potentially helpful for other people in our particular discussion to hear from. Does anyone have questions or comments about looking at an article like this? Think specifically reading for purpose. Was anyone able to try to use a comment? Were you able to view my comments?
I like what you were saying, like to focus on the abstract, like in the beginning. That, like, just you saying that gives me a better perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps you narrow up whether or not you want to keep this article, or, you know, what you're looking at. Absolutely. Yeah. Good. I'm glad. You'll notice that keywords over here also helpful if you're researching to, you know, other ways to think about if this is a helpful article, that you also might look up these particular words: leadership style, profit status, social work, etc. Any other last minute things? Again, we have 2 minutes left. I don't want to keep you over time. But any other questions or ideas about encountering an article, scholarly article from the Journal of Social Work in End of Life and Palliative Care, for example? Again, think about reading for purpose. What kind of a question might you have when you're reading something like this? The audience seems to be someone that's interested in retaining hospice social workers in a particular setting. And how do they do that? How do they create a sort of job satisfaction for these social workers? And so the authors are interested in perhaps addressing maybe managers for these particular institutions. It's a very specific kind of investigation here into job satisfaction of a very particular kind of worker. So something to just keep in mind, that's sort of having the context there, starting with the abstract, for example. And then again, finding those same key areas that we talked about, the introduction, the methods, the results, the discussion, and then finally the references, the resources that they've used in the article. Always a great place to look also if there's something that you've liked about this article, further research to follow up with. But just kind of being smart about reading scholarly articles, being strategic, I think will help you. And now we're at 8 o'clock. I wanted to show you very briefly how to make an appointment if you'd like to talk about your specific articles or reading strategies tailored towards you. So click on the Academic Support Center at AU. Augie, if you wouldn't mind sending the link to our chat box. When you get to this particular, this link should take you to schedule a tutoring appointment, and it'll bring up a writing and skills calendar. And again, I'm Ashley Ott, but there's also a whole bunch of excellent writing specialists / reading specialists, Augie, Chris, Jeremy, Laura, to name a few. And this, anytime you see a white space, that means it's an invitation to schedule an appointment. As you can see, we're nearly booked up until Saturday. So again, look ahead if any of you have questions or want some personalized ideas and care with your writing and or reading strategies. We'd be happy to help you. Thank you so much for spending your time with me this evening. I really appreciate seeing you, and you know, any way that we can help you in the Academic Support Center at AU. Thank you again. I'd love to hear back from you, and thanks for listening.